The silver-haired werewolf girl I freed from the arena. How much is a life worth when it is measured in the roar of a bloodthirsty crowd and the weight of silver chains? 7 million credits can buy a heavy cruiser or a small station in the outer rim. But today it only buys a girl with silver hair and a broken spirit. Freedom is the only currency that matters in a galaxy that treats people like replaceable parts. Griffin stood on the scorched landing pad of Ethelgard, the red dust of the moon swirling around his heavy boots. High above, the massive gas giant loomed like a bruised eye in the sky, casting a sickly violet light over the arena. He did not look at the sky. He looked at the girl in the energy cage. Her hair was the color of a dying star, a brilliant, metallic silver that matted against her face. She wore leather wraps and bronze armguards that were scarred from blade strikes. She did not look like a monster. She looked like a soldier who had forgotten there was a world outside the mud. The pit boss stood beside Griffin, his breath smelling of cheap synthetic tobacco and rot. He tapped a dirty fingernail against the display of Griffin's credit drive. "You are throwing away a fortune," the man said with a jagged sneer. 7 million credits. That is a military pension and then some. You could buy a moon in a better sector for that kind of money. Instead, you are buying a beast that will likely throat-trip you in your sleep. She is not a pet, Commander. She is a silver fang. She was bred to kill things twice your size. Griffin did not turn his head. His cybernetic left arm whirred softly, the internal servos adjusting to the heavy gravity of Ethelgard. "The transaction is already authorized," he said. His voice was like grinding stones, low and steady. "Open the cage." The pit boss laughed and swiped his thumb across the control pad. The energy bars did not flicker. They vanished with a sharp crack of displaced air. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the wind. Then the girl moved. She was a blur of silver and muscle, leaping from the shadows of the cell with her claws extended. She hit the red dust with a heavy thud and lunged toward Griffin's throat. Griffin did not pull his sidearm. He did not even flinch. He planted his boots firmly in the grit and stood his ground. Just before her claws could find his skin, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a standard-issue military canteen. He held it out, not as a shield, but as an offering. Aubrey froze. Her chest heaved as she breathed in the dry, dusty air. Her eyes were wide, flashing with a primal hunger and a deep, flickering confusion. Her claws were inches from his throat, sharp enough to part his carotid artery without a second thought. She looked at the canteen, then up at Griffin's face. He saw the scars on her cheeks and the way her ears twitched at the distant sound of the crowd cheering for the next execution. "You are not a beast to me, kid," Griffin said quietly. "You are just someone who has fought enough for one lifetime. Take the water. It is clean." The silver-haired girl remained tensed, her muscles coiled like a spring. She sniffed the air, her nose wrinkling as she caught the scent of the water and the lack of fear on the man standing before her. Slowly, the lethal tension in her shoulders began to bleed away. She retracted her claws, the metallic tips clicking softly against her bronze guards. She snatched the canteen with a movement so fast it was almost invisible, unscrewing the cap and drinking with a desperate, frantic intensity. The pit boss spat on the ground. "A waste of good credits," he muttered. "I give you 2 hours before she remembers she is a predator and you are just meat in a flight suit." Griffin ignored him. He looked at Aubrey, who was wiping water from her chin with the back of her hand. "Can you walk?" he asked. She looked toward the distant silhouette of the steel Talon sitting on the edge of the landing field. The freighter was a rusted hunk of core world engineering, but it was sturdy. She looked back at the arena, where the next pair of combatants were being led into the pits. Her eyes darkened with a flash of cold, sharp hatred. "I can run if I have to," she whispered. Her voice was thin, unused to anything but snarls and screams. "Then let us get out of here before they change their minds about the price," Griffin said. They walked across the expanse of the red moon, leaving the shouting crowds behind. The silence of the desert was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clank of Griffin's boots and the near-silent padding of Aubrey's feet. She stayed 3 paces behind him, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats. Every time a gust of wind caught a piece of scrap metal and made it clang, she hissed, her body dropping into a low crouch. "Relax," Griffin said without turning around. "My ship has a perimeter alarm. Nothing gets close without me knowing." "Why did you do it?" Aubrey asked. Her voice was stronger now, though it still held a jagged edge. "You do not know me. I have killed many people. Some of them were like you." Griffin stopped at the base of the steel talon's ramp. He turned to look at her, really look at her, beneath the grime and the silver hair. "I spent 20 years in the Terran vanguard taking things away from people," he said. "I decided it was time I gave something back. Besides, I need a navigator who knows how to spot a predator." Aubrey looked at the ship, then at the man. "I am not a navigator," she said. "I do not know how to be anything else but what they made me." Griffin hit the button to lower the airlock. The heavy metal door groaned as it descended, hitting the red dust with a solid thud. "Then we will figure it out together," he replied. He stepped onto the ramp and waited. Aubrey hesitated, her gaze drifting back to the arena one last time. She saw the lights of the facility flickering in the violet twilight, a place of pain and iron. She turned her back on it and walked up the ramp, her silver hair shimmering in the amber glow of the ship's interior lights. As the airlock sealed shut, the pressurized hiss of oxygen filled the cabin. For the first time in years, Aubrey did not smell blood or fear. She smelled recycled air, machine oil, and the faint, lingering scent of something she could not quite name. It was the smell of a home. Griffin walked to the cockpit and began the pre-flight sequence. The engines did not hum. They roared to life with a mechanical growl that vibrated through the floorboards. "Sit down, kid," he called out over the noise. "We are leaving Ethelgard and we are not coming back." Aubrey sat in the co-pilot's chair, her fingers tracing the edges of the flight console. She looked at the stars appearing through the viewport as the ship broke through the thin atmosphere. "I do not even know your name," she said. "Griffin," he said, pulling back on the thrusters. "And yours is Aubrey, right? I saw it on the manifest." She nodded slowly, the name feeling strange in her own mind. Aubrey. It sounded like someone who lived a long time ago. "Welcome to the crew, Aubrey," Griffin said. He pushed the throttle forward and the steel talon leaped into the dark, leaving the red moon and the cages behind forever. The steel talon pushed through the veil of the Kalo sector, leaving the scorched memory of Ethelgard behind. Inside the cockpit, the air felt different. It was filtered and cool, lacking the metallic tang of the arena. Aubrey did not sit for long. Her body was a coiled spring, calibrated for threats that were no longer there. She paced the length of the galley, her bare feet silent on the deck plating. Every time a hydraulic line hissed or a vent cycled, her shoulders tensed and her silver hair shifted like a predator sensing a change in the wind. Griffin watched her through the small reflection in the primary flight display. He did not tell her to relax. He knew better than to ask a soldier to drop their guard before they felt safe. Instead, he kept his hands visible on the flight yoke, moving with deliberate, steady motions. He wanted her to see that he was in control, not out of a desire for dominance, but to provide a foundation of stability. "Do you want to see how the navigation works?" Griffin asked. He did not turn around, giving her the space to approach on her own terms. Aubrey stopped her packing. She moved toward the front of the ship, her eyes scanning the hundreds of glowing switches and readouts. "It is a lot of lights for one person to watch," she said. Her voice was still raspy, a remnant of the dust she had inhaled for years in the pits. "The ship does most of the heavy lifting," Griffin explained. He pointed to a blue crystalline display near the center console. "This is the inertial dampener. It keeps us from being crushed when we jump. And this is the long-range scanner. It tells us who else is in the dark with us." She leaned in closer, her scent reminding him of rain on hot stone. She pointed a sharp, manicured claw at a flickering amber icon. "What is that one?" "That is a fuel warning," Griffin said with a dry chuckle. It means we need to stop at Oryx Prime before we get much deeper into the sector. It is a neutral station, mostly miners and independent haulers. We can get you some real clothes there too. Aubrey looked down at her tattered leather wraps and the bronze guards that were bolted to her forearms. I have worn these since I was a child, she whispered. They are the only things that belong to me. Griffin looked at the scars where the bronze met her skin. They are not yours, Aubrey. They are the marks of the people who owned you. You can keep them if you want, but you do not have to. She did not answer. She simply watched the stars streak past the viewport, a shimmering blur of white against the infinite black. The approach to Oryx Prime was smooth. The station was a massive, jagged ring of iron and glass built into the side of a hollowed-out asteroid. It did not have the polished shine of the core worlds. It was a place of work, grease, and secrets. Griffin guided the freighter into docking bay 94, the landing struts groaning as they took the weight of the ship. "Stay behind me," Griffin said as the ramp lowered. "People here mind their own business, but they have eyes for things that look expensive." Aubrey followed him, her gaze darting between the massive cranes and the workers in heavy exosuits. She stayed close, her hand hovering near the small blade Griffin had given her earlier. They were met at the base of the ramp by a man covered in more oil than skin. Sawyer wiped his hands on a rag that was already black, a wide grin breaking through the grime on his face. "Griffin, you old war dog," Sawyer shouted. "I heard you retired to the moons. I did not think I would see the Talon in this neck of the woods again." "I needed a refit and some supplies, Sawyer," Griffin said, shaking the man's hand. Sawyer's eyes drifted toward Aubrey. He froze, his grin faltering for a split second before he regained his composure. He looked back at Griffin, his voice dropping an octave. "You have got a lot of nerve bringing a Silverfang onto a public station, Griff. Do you have any idea what the bounty boards are looking like right now?" Griffin stepped forward, his cybernetic arm making a soft whirring sound as he closed the distance. "I know exactly what they look like. That is why we are here. I need the ship scrubbed of its transponder signature and a fresh coat of lead paint on the hull." Sawyer whistled low, glancing around the bay to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "It is not just the credits, man. The arena owners on Ethelgard are putting out a priority extraction order. They are calling it a theft. They want the girl back, and they want your head on a spike to discourage anyone else from getting ideas." Aubrey's eyes flashed with a sudden, cold fire. Her claws extended instinctively, the sharp tips clicking against the metal floor. "I am not a prize to be returned," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Sawyer held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I am not the one you have to worry about, lady. I am just the guy who fixes the engines. But Griffin, if you are doing this, you are going all in. There is no middle ground once you cross the syndicates." "I have been all in since the moment I walked into that pit," Griffin said firmly. "Just get the work done, Sawyer. We leave at 600. Sawyer nodded and hurried off toward a bank of consoles, already shouting orders to his crew. Griffin turned to Aubrey and saw the tension in her jaw. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing a hand on her shoulder. His touch was heavy and warm. "They will not take you back," he promised. "Why do you do this?" Aubrey asked, her eyes searching his. "You could have lived a quiet life with your pension. You are risking everything for someone who tried to kill you the moment she was free." Griffin looked out at the station, watching the distant ships move like fireflies in the dark. "Because I spent 20 years being the man who followed the orders. I broke things and I ended lives because someone told me it was for the greater good. It never was. Saving you is the first thing I have done that actually feels right." Aubrey leaned into his hand, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I do not know how to be a person, Griffin. I only know how to be a weapon." "Then we will start with the basics," he said. "Come on. Let us go find you some boots that do not have blood on them." They spent the next few hours navigating the crowded corridors of Oryx Prime. Griffin bought her a flight suit made of durable, dark fabric and a heavy cloak to hide her silver hair. He watched as she touched the fabrics, her fingers marveling at the softness of wool and the smooth finish of synthetic silk. It was a small thing, but it was the first time he saw the hardness in her eyes begin to melt. As they walked back toward the docks, Aubrey stopped at a small stall selling fruit from the inner systems. She looked at a bright blue sphere, her brow furrowed in confusion. "It is a berry pear," Griffin said, buying one and handing it to her. "Try it." She took a cautious bite, her eyes widening at the sweetness. A small smile touched her lips, the first real expression of joy he had seen from her. In that moment, she did not look like a gladiator or a beast. She looked like a woman who was finally realizing the world was larger than a cage. The warmth of the moment was shattered when Griffin's comlink chirped with a frantic signal from Sawyer. "Griffin, get back here now," Sawyer's voice crackled. "We have got company in the bay. Black Hull hunters. They found your signature faster than I could scrub it." Griffin grabbed Aubrey's hand, his face hardening back into the mask of a soldier. "Run," he commanded. They sprinted through the station, weaving through the crowds of miners. Aubrey moved with a grace that surpassed Griffin, her instincts taking over as she scouted the corners ahead. They reached the docking bay just as a group of armored men began boarding the Steel Talon. Griffin drew his pulse rifle, his thumb flicking the safety to the off position. "Stay low," he told Aubrey. "I told you, Griffin," she said, her eyes glowing with a silver intensity as she crouched, ready to spring. "I am a weapon. Let me be one for you." She did not wait for an answer. She vanished into the shadows of the loading crates, moving with a speed that the hunters were not prepared for. Griffin took a deep breath, braced his cybernetic arm against a support pillar, and opened fire. The battle for their freedom had truly begun, and as he watched Aubrey move through the enemy ranks like a ghost, he knew he had made the right choice. She was not just a survivor, she was the best ally he had ever had. They reached the ramp together, the hunters retreating under the combined pressure of Griffin's precision and Aubrey's ferocity. As the airlock hissed shut, Griffin slammed the controls to retract the docking clamps. Sawyer was already in the engine room, yelling through the intercom. "Go, go, go. I gave you a temporary boost on the thrusters, but it won't last." The Steel Talon lurched forward, breaking away from Oryx Prime and diving back into the safety of the stars. In the quiet of the cockpit, Aubrey sat in the co-pilot's chair, her chest heaving as she looked at Griffin. "We are still alive," she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "We are," Griffin agreed, his hand finding hers in the dim light of the console. "And we are going to stay that way." Vesper Station was a jagged tooth of metal and rock floating in the debris belt of the Alundra system. Griffin guided the Steel Talon into a shadowed docking bay, his fingers moving across the controls with practiced ease. The ship settled onto the landing struts with a heavy metallic clank. Aubrey stood behind him, her eyes scanning the flickering lights of the hangar. Her hand rested on the hilt of the blade she had taken from the hunters on Oryx Prime. She was still a creature of the pits, wary of every corner and every shadow. "We are safe here for the moment," Griffin said, turning in his chair to look at her. "Delaney is an old friend. She does not care about bounties. She only cares about the truth." Aubrey nodded, though her posture remained rigid. "I have spent my life hearing that I am safe right before the whip cracks," she said. Griffin stood up and walked toward her, stopping just outside her personal space. "I know. I cannot ask you to trust the galaxy, but I am asking you to trust me. We need to know why they want you so badly. It is more than just a few arena credits." Sawyer walked into the cockpit, wiping grease from his forehead with a rag. "I will stay with the ship. If I can reroute the power to the cloaking baffles, we might be able to stay hidden if a patrol passes by. But Griffin, be careful. This station is a hive of whispers." They left the ship and headed down a narrow corridor lined with exposed pipes and flickering neon signs. Delaney's office was tucked away behind a reinforced blast door at the end of a winding sublevel. When the door hissed open, a woman with sharp features and short-cropped gray hair looked up from a bank of monitors. "Griffin," Delaney said, her voice a mix of relief and concern. "You look like you have been dragged through a black hole." "I have had a busy week," Delaney, Griffin replied. "This is Aubrey." Delaney's eyes drifted to Aubrey, widening slightly as she took in the silver hair and the bronze armguards. She did not say a word, pointing instead to a diagnostic bed in the center of the room. "Sit. I need to see what we are dealing with." Aubrey looked at Griffin, who gave a small, encouraging nod. She sat on the edge of the bed, her claws digging slightly into the padded surface. Delaney moved a handheld scanner over Aubrey's skin, watching the data flow across a holographic display. The silence in the room grew heavy as the lines of code turned from blue to a deep, pulsing amber. Delaney's face went pale. She stepped back from the terminal, her hands trembling slightly as she tapped a few keys to lock the door. "What is it?" Griffin asked, stepping forward. "She is not just a pit fighter, Griffin," Delaney whispered, her voice tight with a sudden fear. "She is the last survivor of the Silverfang lineage from the ravaged Rim." Griffin frowned, searching his memory of the border wars. "I thought the Silverfangs were a myth, a legend about a guardian caste that disappeared during the Great Collapse." "They were real," Delaney said, turning the monitor so they could both see. "They were a genetically engineered vanguard, designed to protect the deep space vaults. Their DNA is a biological encryption key. Look at these markers." Vane was not just keeping her in that arena for the betting pools. He was trying to trigger a dormant sequence in her blood. He was trying to turn her into a master key for the Silverfang armory. Aubrey stood up, her chest heaving. "I am not a weapon," she snarled, her silver hair bristling. "I am not a tool for their wars. They told me I was a slave because I was a beast. Now you tell me I am a slave because of my blood." Griffin stepped between her and the terminal, his cybernetic hand resting on her shoulder. "You are whatever you choose to be now," he said, his voice firm and steady. "The blood in your veins does not dictate your soul. I did not pull you out of that pit to hand you over to another master." Aubrey looked at him, the fury in her eyes softening into something more fragile. "They will never stop coming for me, will they?" Delaney interrupted, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "It is worse than that. I just found a subdermal pulse. Griffin, there is a beacon embedded in the ship's signature. It was not on the Talon. It was linked to her biometric profile the moment she stepped onto the ship. Vane is already tracking us. He has been watching your flight path since you left Oryx Prime." A warning light began to flash red on the main console. "A proximity alert," Delaney said, her voice rising. "3 ships just dropped out of warp on the edge of the debris belt. They are heavy interceptors." Aubrey's claws extended, her instincts taking over. "We cannot hide. If I am the key, then I am the only one who can close the door." "What are you saying?" Griffin asked. "The armory on the moon of Jorasix," Aubrey said, her voice filled with a new, cold authority. "It contains the technology they want. If we get there first, I can use the genetic override to lock the vault forever. Or I can use what is inside to make sure Vane never hurts anyone else." Griffin looked at the monitors, then back at Aubrey. He saw the transformation in her. She was no longer the scared girl in the red dust of the arena. She was a woman finding her power in the middle of a storm. "We go to Jorasix," Griffin said. "Delaney, give us the coordinates and clear a path through the station's defense grid." "I can give you a window of 30 seconds before the interceptors lock on to your thruster trail," Delaney said, transferring the data to Griffin's wrist link. "Go. If you stay here, this station becomes a graveyard." They ran back toward the docking bay, the station's alarms beginning to wail in the distance. Griffin felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the weight of the mission settling into his bones. He had spent years fighting for causes he did not understand, but this was different. This was about more than a lineage or a vault. It was about the woman running beside him, her silver hair a streak of moonlight in the dark corridors. They reached the steel talon just as the hangar doors began to cycle open. Sawyer was already in the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the manual overrides. "We have company," Sawyer shouted over the roar of the engines. "Big company." "Get us out of here," Griffin yelled, sliding into the co-pilot's chair as Aubrey strapped herself into the tactical station. "Set a course for Jora 6. We are taking the fight to them." The ship lurched forward, the engines screaming as they pushed past the safety limits. As they cleared the docking bay, Griffin saw the 3 interceptors looming in the dark, their weapon ports glowing with a lethal energy. He looked over at Aubrey, who was calmly calibrating the shield harmonics. She caught his gaze and gave a small, grim smile. "We are not running anymore, are we?" "No," Griffin said, his hand finding the throttle. "We are finishing this." The steel talon dove into the debris belt, weaving through the jagged rocks as the first volleys of plasma fire lit up the void behind them. They were no longer just survivors. They were a storm of their own making, heading toward a destiny written in the stars and the blood of a forgotten age. Griffin felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the ship's heaters. For the first time in a long time, he knew exactly where he was supposed to be. He was with her, and that was the only world that mattered. The jump drive began to whine, the space in front of them stretching into a long, white tunnel of light. As the stars blurred into streaks, Griffin reached out and squeezed Aubrey's hand. She squeezed back, her grip strong and certain. They vanished into the fold, leaving the hunters behind and racing toward the moon that held the secrets of her past and the hope for their future. Aubrey watched the light of the jump drive reflected in the cockpit glass. "I was born in a cage," she whispered, more to herself than to him, "but I think I was meant to fly." "You were always meant to fly," Griffin said. "I just provided the wings." The ship settled into the rhythmic vibration of faster-than-light travel, the silence of the cabin a brief sanctuary before the coming battle. They were a veteran with a broken arm and a gladiator with a hidden crown, and together, they were the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Griffin leaned back in his chair, watching the coordinates for Jora 6 count down on the screen. He did not know what they would find in the armory, but he knew one thing for certain. As long as he had a breath left in his lungs, no one would ever put Aubrey in a cage again. She was the light in the dark of his long, weary life, and he would burn the stars themselves to keep her free. The journey was far from over, but as the steel talon hurtled through the void, the bond between them felt stronger than any metal or any law. They were partners, allies, and something more that neither of them had the words for yet. But they had time. For the first time in their lives, they had a future worth fighting for. Aubrey rested her head against the back of the seat, her eyes closing for a brief moment of rest. "I am ready," she said. "I know you are," Griffin replied. "Now let us go show them what a Silver Fang can really do." The ship sped on, a lone spark of defiance in the vast, uncaring darkness of the sector, carrying the last of a lineage and the man who had given everything to save her. Their story was no longer about escape. It was about reclaiming the pieces of a broken world and building something new from the shards. And as the distant moon of Jora 6 began to appear on the long-range scanners, Griffin knew that the real fight was only just beginning. But he was not afraid. He had Aubrey by his side, and together they were unstoppable. The silence of the cabin was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. In that moment, Griffin realized that home was not a place or a planet. It was the steady pulse of a shared purpose and the warmth of a hand held in the dark. He watched her sleep, her breathing even and calm, and he felt a sense of peace he had never known. They were going to make it. They were going to be free. And that was a promise he intended to keep, no matter the cost. As the countdown reached 0, the ship dropped out of warp, the jagged, ice-covered surface of Jora 6 filling the viewscreen. It was a cold, desolate world, but to Griffin and Aubrey, it was the key to everything. The battle was coming, but for now they were together, and that was enough. They had found each other in the ruins of their lives, and they would build a new one among the stars, one victory at a time. The steel talon descended toward the frozen moon, a silent predator returning to its den, ready to face whatever waited in the shadows. This was their moment, and they were ready for it. Together, they would change the galaxy, one heartbeat at a time. Griffin tightened his grip on the controls, his heart full of a strange, beautiful hope. The future was theirs to write, and he could not wait to see what the next page held. The steel talon shuddered as a plasma bolt clipped the port thruster, sending a violent vibration through the deck plates that Griffin felt deep in his marrow. He slammed his hand against the console, rerouting the remaining power from the galley to the rear shields. The ice-covered surface of Jurassic rushed up to meet them, a jagged expanse of white and deep blue shadows. Behind them, 3 high-velocity interceptors streaked through the thin atmosphere, their engines glowing like angry embers against the twilight. "Hold on to something," Griffin shouted over the screaming alarms. "We are going in hot." Aubrey was already strapped into the co-pilot seat, her hands hovering over the weapons array. Her eyes were fixed on the tactical display, watching the red icons of their pursuers close the gap. "They are locking on again," she said, her voice remarkably steady for someone about to crash. "Should I dump the chaff?" "Wait for my signal," Griffin replied, his jaw set as he fought the yoke. The ship groaned, metal twisting under the atmospheric pressure. "Now." Aubrey slammed the release. A cloud of metallic glitter exploded from the rear of the freighter, blooming like a silver cloud. The incoming missiles lost their lock, detonating harmlessly in the sky, but the shockwave tossed the steel talon like a toy. A massive crystalline spire loomed directly ahead. Griffin yanked the controls, narrowly missing the peak, but the belly of the ship scraped the ice with a sound like 1,000 saws. The impact threw Sawyer across the engineering bay. Griffin heard a dull thud and a groan over the comms, followed by Delaney calling out for him. Then the world turned into a chaotic blur of white snow and screaming metal. The freighter skidded across a frozen lake, carving a deep trench into the ancient ice before slamming into a snowbank at the base of a towering ridge. Silence rushed into the cabin, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the faint hiss of a broken coolant line. Griffin blinked, shaking his head to clear the stars from his vision. His cybernetic arm was dead weight at his side, blue sparks jumping from the fractured casing at his elbow. He looked over at Aubrey. She was already unbuckling her harness, her movements fluid and predatory even in the wreckage. "Are you hurt?" Griffin asked, his voice rasping. "I am fine," she said, leaning over to check his arm. "You are sparking, Griffin." "I will survive," he muttered, unlatching his own belt and stumbling out of the seat. "We need to check on the others." They scrambled into the main hold. The interior of the ship was a wreck. Crates had shifted, and a heavy support beam had buckled, pinning Delaney against the galley wall. Sawyer lay nearby, a dark bruise forming on his temple, unconscious but breathing. Griffin reached for the beam, intending to use his mechanical strength to heave it off her, but as he braced himself, his arm let out a pathetic whine and died completely. He grunted in frustration, leaning his shoulder against the metal, but without the hydraulic assist, the beam did not budge. "Let me," Aubrey said, stepping in beside him. She didn't just pull. She braced her feet against the deck and heaved with a raw, primal strength that made the deck plates groan. Slowly, the beam shifted. Griffin slid his good arm under Delaney's shoulders and pulled her clear just as Aubrey let the metal drop. "Is she okay?" Aubrey asked, her chest heaving. Delaney coughed, clutching her ribs. "I am alive. My legs are intact, but I think I cracked a rib or two. Where is Sawyer?" Griffin checked the mechanic. "He is out cold. We do not have much time. Vane's dropships will be landing any minute. They saw us go down." He looked at his dead arm, then at the flickering lights of the ship. Without power, they were sitting ducks in a frozen wasteland. He felt a rare flicker of helplessness, a ghost of the failures that had haunted his military career. He had promised Aubrey freedom, and now he had led her into a cage of ice and steel. Aubrey saw the look in his eyes. She reached out, her hand resting briefly on his chest. "You did not fail, Griffin. You got us down. Now it is my turn to keep us here." "What are you talking about?" Griffin asked. "They want the Silver Fang," she said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "They think they are hunting a prize. I am going to show them they are hunting a ghost." "You cannot go out there alone," Griffin protested, reaching for her with his working hand. "There are dozens of them, and they have thermal gear." "The storm is picking up," Aubrey countered, gesturing toward the view screen where whiteout conditions were already swallowing the ship. "They will be blind. I grew up in the dark, Griffin. I fought in pits where they turned the lights off just to hear us scream. This ice is nothing compared to that." She moved to the weapon locker and pulled out a pair of serrated daggers and a compact pulse pistol. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like the legend Delaney had described. "Stay here," she commanded. "Get the power back online. Wake Sawyer. If the ship can fly, we can get to the armory. If I am not back by the time the engines prime, you leave." "I am not leaving you," Griffin said, his voice hard. "Then make sure this ship is ready to go when I come back," she replied. She didn't wait for an argument. She hit the manual release on the airlock, and a gust of freezing air and snow swirled into the hold. Aubrey stepped into the white void, her silver hair blending instantly into the storm. The door hissed shut, leaving Griffin in the dim, red emergency lighting of the dying ship. Griffin didn't waste a second. He turned to Delaney. "Can you reach the junction box?" "I can try," she said, leaning on a crate for support. Griffin knelt by his dead arm, pulling a multi-tool from his belt with his teeth. He had to bypass the fried actuators and slave the arm's battery to his nervous system. It would hurt like hell, but he needed 2 hands to fix the primary power coupling. He bit down on a piece of leather and jammed the tool into the seam of his prosthetic. A jolt of raw electricity surged through his shoulder, making his vision white out for a second. He groaned, his muscles locking up, but when the smoke cleared, the arm whirred back to life. It was sluggish and missing its fine motor skills, but it worked. He turned toward the engine room, but stopped as a muffled explosion echoed from outside. The hunters had arrived. He could picture Aubrey out there, a shadow in the snow, moving between the crags. He knew how she fought. She wouldn't trade shots with them. She would wait until they were isolated, until the cold began to seep into their joints, and then she would strike. But even a Silver Fang could be overwhelmed by numbers. He reached for a pulse rifle mounted near the door, checking the charge. He wasn't going to sit in a dark ship while she bled for him. Sawyer moaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Griffin, why is it so cold?" "Get up, Sawyer," Griffin said, hauling the mechanic to his feet. "I need you on the power core. Delaney will guide you. I am going to the perimeter." Griffin checked the seals on his flight suit and stepped toward the airlock. He felt a strange, fierce heat in his chest that had nothing to do with the ship's failing heaters. He had spent years drifting, a man without a cause or a home, but as he looked out into the freezing dark of Jurassic, he realized he had found both. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the woman who had looked at a broken veteran and seen a man worth trusting. He stepped out into the storm, the wind howling like a wounded beast. In the distance, the flash of a pulse round lit up the snow, followed by a scream that was cut short by the wind. Aubrey was at work. Griffin raised his rifle, his boots crunching on the ice as he moved toward the sound of the fight. He would find her, and together, they would turn this frozen moon into a graveyard for anyone who tried to take their freedom away. The snow on Jurassic did not just fall. It drove against Griffin like a physical weight, a wall of white that sought to bury him where he stood. He kept his rifle tight against his shoulder, his eyes darting between the thermal signatures flickering on his HUD. To his left, a sudden flare of orange light cut through the haze. A mercenary stumbled backward out of a ravine, his chest armor melted by a high-frequency blade. He didn't even have time to scream before the storm swallowed him again. Griffin moved toward the kill. He found Aubrey crouched behind a jagged spire of ice, her silver hair matted with frost and her breathing heavy. She didn't look startled when he approached. She simply shifted her weight, her eyes locked on the valley below where two more dropships were banking for a landing. "I told you to stay with the ship," Aubrey said, her voice a low rasp that barely carried over the wind. "I am not very good at following orders," Griffin replied. He took a position beside her, checking the charge on his rifle. "Besides, Sawyer and Delaney are making progress. If we don't hold this ridge, it won't matter if the engines start or not." Aubrey looked at him, her gaze lingering on his sparking cybernetic arm. "You are hurt. You should not be out here." "I have been hurt for 20 years, Aubrey. A little cold and some faulty wiring won't stop me now. What is the play?" She pointed toward the largest dropship. "Vane is on that one. I can smell the chemical scent of his cologne even through the ice. He wants the encryption in my blood. He thinks I am a treasure chest he can just crack open." "He is going to find out you are a landmine instead," Griffin said. They moved in unison. Griffin provided the heavy fire, his pulse rifle barking rhythmic, controlled shots that pinned the mercenaries behind their landing struts. He didn't waste ammunition. Every pull of the trigger was a calculated move to force the enemies into the open. Aubrey was a shadow in the white. She blurred through the snow, using the terrain to her advantage. She didn't fight like a soldier. She fought like a predator that had finally been given permission to hunt. A heavy energy bolt slammed into the ice near Griffin's head, sending shards of frozen rock flying. He rolled to the right, his cybernetic arm whining as he braced himself against the ground. Vane stepped out of the primary dropship, a massive man clad in blackened power armor. He held a vibrating energy blade that hummed with a sickly violet light. "Griffin," Vane shouted, his voice amplified by his helmet's speakers. "You were a decorated commander. Now you are a scavenger protecting a piece of property that doesn't belong to you. Hand over the girl and I might let you die with some dignity." Griffin stood up, his rifle leveled at Vane's chest. "She is not property, and I stopped caring about dignity the day I realized men like you were the ones giving the medals." Vane laughed and charged. He moved with surprising speed for a man in heavy armor. Griffin fired, but the shots deflected off Vane's kinetic shielding. The warlord swung the energy blade in a wide arc, forcing Griffin to dive backward. The blade sliced through a nearby rock as if it were butter. Griffin scrambled for his sidearm, but Vane was already closing the gap, raising the blade for a killing blow. A silver streak collided with Vane from the side. Aubrey tackled him with enough force to dent the power armor, her claws raking across the faceplate. Vane roared in frustration, swinging his gauntleted fist to throw her off. She flipped backward, landing lightly on her feet, her eyes glowing with a fierce, ancient light. "You should have stayed in the cage, little wolf," Vane sneered, resetting his shields. "I was never in a cage," Aubrey retorted, her voice ringing with a new authority. "I was just waiting for someone worth fighting for." She lunged again. This time, Griffin didn't stay on the sidelines. He moved in a flanking maneuver, using his rifle to target the cooling vents on Vane's back. As Aubrey drew Vane's attention with a flurry of strikes, Griffin fired a concentrated burst into the exposed heat sinks. The armor hissed, steam erupting from the seals as the internal systems began to overheat. Vane stumbled, his movement slowing as his power suit fought to regulate the temperature. Aubrey didn't give him a second to recover. She grabbed the hilt of his own energy blade, her fingers twisting the controls until the violet light flared and died. With a final, guttural cry, she delivered a spinning kick that shattered Vane's helmet, sending the man crashing into the frozen dirt. Griffin walked up to the fallen warlord, his rifle held steady. "It is over, Vane." The remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader defeated, retreated toward the smaller ships. They weren't paid enough to die for a dead man's ambition. Within minutes, the roar of engines signaled their departure, leaving the valley in a sudden, ringing silence. Aubrey stood over Vane, her chest heaving. She looked at Griffin, the adrenaline slowly fading from her expression. Is he dead? He is finished, Griffin said, checking Vane's pulse. He won't be bothering anyone ever again. They made their way back to the Steel Talon. The ship looked battered, its hull scorched and its landing gear twisted, but the lights in the cockpit were glowing a steady, hopeful green. Sawyer stood at the bottom of the ramp, a wrench in one hand and a wide grin on his face. She is purring like a kitten, Sawyer shouted over the wind. Delaney found the override for the registry. We can do it right now. Inside the ship, the air was warm and smelled of recycled oxygen and grease. Delaney was hunched over the main console, her fingers flying across the holographic interface. She looked up as Griffin and Aubrey entered, her eyes bright with success. I have the link to the Central Galactic Registry, Delaney explained. If I upload the virus now, it will scrub every trace of Aubrey's DNA signature from their databases. To the rest of the galaxy, the Silverfang lineage will officially be extinct. No one will ever be able to track her again. Do it, Aubrey said. Delaney hit the final key. A progress bar flashed on the screen, flickering through millions of data points before turning solid gold. The word deleted appeared in bold letters. Aubrey let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for her entire life. She slumped into a pilot's chair, her hands trembling slightly. It is done, Griffin said, placing a hand on her shoulder. You are a ghost now. You can be whoever you want to be. I want to be somewhere quiet, she whispered. They flew for 3 days, navigating the outer rim until they found a world that didn't appear on any modern star chart. Griffin named it Valles. It was a planet of rolling hills covered in vibrant blue grass that swayed in a gentle, constant breeze. There were no cities, no stations, and no wars. Griffin and Aubrey sat on the lowered ramp of the Steel Talon as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky was a gradient of deep purple and soft gold, reflecting off the calm waters of a nearby lake. Sawyer and Delaney were inside, already talking about building a permanent shelter and a garden. I didn't think it would feel like this, Aubrey said, leaning her head against Griffin's shoulder. Like what, he asked. Like I can finally stop looking behind me. Like the air is actually enough to breathe. Griffin looked out at the horizon. He had spent his life searching for a sense of peace that he thought had died on the battlefields of his youth. He realized now that peace wasn't a place you found. It was something you built with the people who saw the truth of you. I think I like the silence, Aubrey said, her hand finding his. It is the best sound in the world, Griffin agreed. They sat there together, two survivors who had found a home in the vast, empty stars. The Steel Talon rested behind them, a silent sentinel for a future that was finally theirs to write. For the first time in either of their lives, there was no fight left to win. There was only the warmth of the sun and the steady, quiet promise of tomorrow. The morning sun on Valles felt different than the harsh glare of Ethelgard. It was a soft, golden light that didn't burn. Griffin stood near the edge of a clearing, his cybernetic arm locked into a high-torque setting as he hoisted a massive support beam. He guided the Durasteel pillar into the foundation they had carved from the blue rock of the hillside. He didn't need a targeting computer to know it was level. His hands had learned the rhythm of construction over the last few weeks, a sharp contrast to the rhythm of reloading a rifle. Aubrey dropped from the roof of the Steel Talon, landing silently in the tall grass. She wasn't wearing her gladiator bronze today. She wore a simple flight suit, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the scars on her forearms. She carried a crate of power couplings and set them down near Griffin's feet. Her movements were still fluid and predatory, but the tension in her jaw had finally vanished. That beam is crooked by 2 centimeters, Aubrey said, a small smirk playing on her lips. Griffin grunted, adjusting his grip. My internal level says it is perfect. Are you questioning the sensors of a veteran or just trying to get out of hauling the next load? Maybe both, she replied, stepping closer to help him steady the weight. I spent my life tearing things down, Griffin. Building something feels slower than I expected. It requires a different kind of focus. It is the kind of focus that keeps you alive when there is nothing left to kill, Griffin said. He tightened the bolts with a pneumatic wrench, the sound echoing across the quiet valley. We are not just making a shelter. We are making a point. What point is that? She asked. That we can exist without a mission, he said. Sawyer emerged from the cargo ramp of the ship, wiping grease from his forehead with a rag. He looked at the half-finished cabin and then back at the ship. The reactor is officially decoupled from the thrusters. We have enough juice to power this whole valley for a decade, but the steel Talon is not going to be winning any races for a while. It is a house now, Griffin. A very expensive, very armored house. It is exactly where it needs to be, Griffin said, releasing the beam. How is Delaney? She is inside trying to turn the long-range comms array into a weather station, Sawyer said with a chuckle. She says if she has to hear one more encrypted syndicate broadcast, she is going to throw the console into the lake. I think she is actually enjoying the quiet. She found a patch of wild grain near the river and wants to see if we can ferment it. Griffin wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at Aubrey. A distillery. We really are becoming settlers. Aubrey laughed, and the sound was clear, free of the rasp that had defined her voice in the pits. I think I would like to see Sawyer try to explain his engineering to a fermenting vat. He will probably try to overclock the yeast. She walked toward the edge of the clearing where the blue grass met a grove of silver-leaf trees. She knelt, running her hand over the soil. There was no blood here, no scent of fear. She looked back at the ship, then at the man who had bought her freedom with everything he owned. Griffin joined her, standing a few paces back. He didn't want to crowd her. He knew she still needed her space to process the sheer scale of the horizon. "Do you miss it?" Griffin asked quietly. "Miss what?" she asked without looking up. "The clarity," he said. "In the pits, or in the war, you always knew who the enemy was. You knew what the next 5 minutes required of you. Out here, the next 50 years are a blank slate. That can be heavier than a rifle." Aubrey stood up, turning to face him. Her silver hair caught the light, shimmering like the edge of a blade. "I do not miss the cage. I do not miss the smell of the sand or the sound of the crowd. But I did wonder for a moment if I would be useless without a fight." "And what did you decide?" Griffin asked. She stepped forward, closing the distance until she could rest her hand against the cold metal of his cybernetic chest plate. "I decided that the fight just changed. Now I am fighting for the garden. I am fighting for the silence. And I am fighting to make sure you don't work yourself to death building a house that is already perfect." Griffin smiled, his hand covering hers. It was a heavy, warm connection. He felt the steady beat of her heart through her palm, a reminder of the life they had preserved. Delaney shouted from the ship's comms external speaker, her voice crackling with a bit of static. "Griffin, Aubrey, get up here. I have something you need to see." They shared a look of brief, instinctual concern before heading toward the ramp. Old habits died hard. Griffin reached for a sidearm that wasn't there, his fingers brushing against his work belt instead. They entered the main hold where Delaney was hovering over a holographic display. Sawyer was already there, his arms crossed. "I thought we scrubbed the registry," Griffin said, his voice dropping into a tactical growl. "We did," Delaney said, waving a hand to dismiss his worry. "This isn't a hunt. It is a ghost signal. It came through a localized relay on the edge of the sector. It was addressed to the steel Talon." She tapped a key, and a grainy audio file began to play. It wasn't a voice they recognized. It was a series of rhythmic pings, followed by a short burst of data. "It is a manifest," Sawyer explained. "A shipment of medical supplies, seeds, and building materials. It was dropped at the edge of the Valley's atmosphere 2 hours ago in an automated crate." "Who sent it?" Aubrey asked. Delaney looked up, a soft expression on her face. "The signature is encrypted, but the header says, "From those who are still running to those who finally stopped." Griffin looked at the data. It was a gift from the underground networks Delaney had used to hide Aubrey's DNA, a tribute from other survivors who had heard the rumors of the veteran and the Silverfang who had escaped the inescapable. "They know we made it," Aubrey whispered. "They know it is possible," Griffin corrected. "That is a dangerous thing to know. It gives people ideas." "Good," Aubrey said. "Let them have ideas. Let them see that the stars are more than just a graveyard." She walked to the viewport, looking out at the sprawling, untouched wilderness of their new home. The crate would be sitting in the valley, a bounty of resources they hadn't asked for but would certainly use. The alliance they had forged in the fire of combat had expanded into something bigger, a quiet network of hope stretching across the black. Griffin walked up behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We should go retrieve that crate before the local wildlife decides the seeds are snacks." "In a minute," Aubrey said. She turned in his arms, her eyes searching his. She looked at the man who had seen a human being where everyone else saw a weapon. She saw the weariness in his eyes, but also the deep, unshakable peace that had taken root since they landed. "Thank you," she said. "For the house?" he asked. "For the tomorrow," she replied. Griffin leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The steel talon hummed behind them, no longer a warship, but a hearth. Outside, the wind moved through the blue grass, a steady, rhythmic pulse that sounded like a promise. They were no longer fugitives or soldiers. They were the architects of a life they had earned with every drop of blood they had ever shed. "Let's go to work," Aubrey said, pulling away with a bright, determined energy. "We have a lot to plant before the sun goes down." Griffin watched her run down the ramp, her laughter trailing behind her. He followed, his boots hitting the soil with a solid, grounding thud. The galaxy was vast and often cruel, but in this small corner of the dark, they had found the only thing that mattered. They had found the start of a story that didn't end in a funeral. The blue grass of Valey's brushed against Griffin's shins as he navigated the steep incline of the northern ridge. Behind him, Aubrey moved with the silent, predatory grace that had once made her the terror of the pits. Now, that energy was channeled into a different kind of intensity. She carried a heavy pulse cutter on her shoulder, not to take a life, but to clear the stubborn thickets near the valley floor. The coordinates for the drop were precise. As they reached the crest of the hill, a small, silver canister sat nestled in a bed of flowering shrubs. It was a standard orbital delivery pod, unmarked and scorched from a low-altitude entry. Griffin knelt beside it, his cybernetic hand whirring as he keyed in the bypass code Delaney had provided. The seals hissed, releasing a puff of pressurized air. Inside, neatly packed crates of heirloom seeds, saplings encased in nutrient gel, and a thick stack of physical blueprints for a hydroponic array waited for them. At the very top lay a small, handwritten note on real parchment. Griffin picked it up. The ink was dark and bold. It read, "For the ones who walked away, make it grow." Aubrey looked over his shoulder, her eyes tracing the words. "People are watching us, aren't they?" she asked. Griffin tucked the note into his jacket pocket. "Not the syndicates, not the warlords, just the ones who are tired of the fighting. We gave them a reason to believe there is a way out." She reached into the pod and pulled out a small glass vial containing golden seeds. "I spent my life breaking things, Griffin. I do not know if I have the hands for this." He took the vial from her, his fingers lingering against hers. "You handled that gladiator blade like it was an extension of your arm. This is just a different kind of tool. We learn as we go." They spent the next 3 hours hauling the supplies back to the valley. The steel talon sat in the center of the clearing, its landing struts buried deep in the soil. Sawyer was perched on top of the hull, welding a series of solar collectors to the dorsal plating. He waved a gloved hand as they approached, his face smeared with grease and a wide, genuine grin. "Power grid is live," Sawyer shouted down. Delaney has the internal climate controls synced to the local cycle. We can start the first batch of crops in the cargo bay tonight. Delaney emerged from the primary airlock, holding a digital level and a coil of wiring. The soil analysis came back clean, she said, her voice full of professional pride. This dirt is richer than anything I saw on the core worlds. If we plant those fruit trees near the stream, they will be producing within 2 cycles. Aubrey dropped the last crate by the ramp and looked around. The valley was shielded by high stone walls, creating a natural fortress that felt like a sanctuary rather than a prison. For the first time since Griffin had met her on the red sands of Ethelgard, the tension in her shoulders had completely vanished. "Let's get the plow attached to the rover," Griffin said. "We have 4 hours of light left." The work was grueling. They used the ship's heavy-duty winch to drag a makeshift plow through the earth, turning the vibrant blue sod into dark, fertile furrows. Griffin drove the rover while Aubrey followed behind, dropping seeds with a rhythmic, steady motion. Sawyer and Delaney worked on the irrigation lines, diverted from a nearby spring that tumbled down the rocks in a crystal-white veil. As the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and deep amber, they gathered near a small fire they had built outside the ship. The smell of wood smoke and damp earth replaced the metallic scent of oil and scorched plating that had defined their lives for so long. Aubrey sat on a flat stone, watching the first stars blink into existence. "On the moons I grew up on, the sky was always choked with smog from the refineries," she said quietly. "I never knew there were this many stars." Griffin sat beside her, handing her a tin mug of hot tea. "Each one of those stars is a sun for someone else," he said. "Most of them are probably fighting the same battles we were." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her silver hair catching the glow of the fire. "But not here." "Not here," Griffin agreed. Sawyer walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "I checked the long-range scanners one last time. The Ghostzig is holding. According to the rest of the galaxy, the Steel Talon was lost in a black hole 3 weeks ago. We are officially off the map." Delaney joined them, sitting cross-legged on the grass. "I sent a final burst transmission through the underground relays. I told them the seeds arrived and the soil is good. I think we might see more pods in the coming months. Tools, books, maybe even more people looking for a place to start over." Aubrey looked at Griffin, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded slowly. "If they come in peace, there is room in the valley. We were never meant to be alone out here." The fire crackled, a spark jumping into the air before vanishing into the darkness. The silence of the planet was not empty. It was full of the sounds of life, the rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant call of native birds. It was a peace they had earned with every scar on their bodies and every nightmare they had survived. Aubrey reached out and took Griffin's hand, her grip firm and warm. "Thank you for buying me," she whispered. Griffin looked at her, his expression softening with a depth of emotion he had spent years trying to suppress. "I didn't buy a gladiator, Aubrey. I bought a future for both of us." She smiled, a rare and beautiful expression that made her look years younger. "And what is the first rule of this new future?" Griffin stood up, pulling her with him. He looked out over the fresh furrows of the field, toward the ship that was now a home and the friends who had become a family. "The first rule is that we don't look back," he said. "We only look at what we are building today." Aubrey stepped closer, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of a heart that no longer lived for war. "Then let's finish the irrigation tomorrow morning. I want to see the first sprouts before the week is out." They walked back toward the Steel Talon together. The ramp hissed shut behind them, sealing out the cold night air. Inside, the lights were warm and yellow, a stark contrast to the harsh blue glow of the cockpit. They had spent their lives as shadows in a galaxy of fire, but here, on the edge of the unknown, they had finally stepped into the light. The story of the Silverfang was over. The story of Vales had just begun. Under the watchful gaze of 1 billion stars, the The veterans and the warriors slept in peace, knowing that when they woke, the only thing they would have to fight was the stubborn earth, and the only thing they would harvest was hope.